wrote Debunking Economics, as I argue in the preface there that neoclassical economics, which is the dominant paradigm of economics today, is more dangerous to capitalism than any number of left-wing revolutionaries, because it's a completely misguided vision of how capitalism functions. And if you follow a misguided vision, managing a complex system or trying to manage a complex system like a capitalist economy, you're going to stuff up.
Okay,
and
so
QE
why is
the
QE
classic
so
stuff up.
misguided?
Sorry?
Why is QE so misguided?
Okay, QE is, the basic principles behind QE are twofold. One is you create these extra reserves for the banks because you're buying bonds off them, you're giving them cash instead, so their holdings of bonds goes down and their reserves, which are cash, go up. They'll lend the cash to the public, part one. And I'm quoting Bernanke here too, by the way. Okay. Part two is that you drive down interest rates, so you make safe assets less attractive, so you buy risky assets. Okay. And part three is that people feel wealthier because those risky assets rise in value, and they'll spend more because of the wealth effect. Those are the basic arguments in favour of QE. Point one, violates accounting laws. Okay. Banks cannot lend reserves, and my hat off to the Bank of England for a wonderful paper they wrote back in the beginning of 2014 or 2015, I think it was 2014, called Money Creation in the Modern Economy.
Yeah.
It's basically an open letter to the conventional economists of the world saying, wake up guys, you have got a totally wrong model of how money's created. Banks do not lend reserves, period. They can't lend them. It's like saying I can use the oil in my car as fuel. No, you can't. The oil in your car makes sure the cylinders turn over. It is not what's powering the cylinders. So there's two separate circulation systems. The banks themselves have accounts as customers of the central bank, and that's what QE is boosting, those particular accounts. That's like the oil, because those reserves are then used by banks when people like you and me make some sort of let's say if I sold that book to you rather than giving it as a gift to money, you might grab your credit card to act, or give me you swipe your card to buy it off me. You might bank with Barclays, I bank with Lloyds. There's going to be a transfer of reserves between the two banks. That's what's actually going on. That's like it's the oil for our personal transactions. You can't use that oil as petrol. But fundamentally, that's what the economic model of banks lending reserves actually is. It's totally fallacious. That's one out the window. Okay? The second one about giving them reserves and making risky assets more desirable, that's true. Okay, that has worked to some extent. And on top of it, and I'm not sure about this, but I think it's logically feasible, is that banks themselves, having a drop in income-earning assets, which are what their bonds were that they've sold as part of QE, and an increase in the cash, that gives them non-income-earning assets in place of income-earning assets. Also, I think QE in England differs from QE in America, because in America I think they only bought bonds off the banks, whereas here they're buying bonds off pension funds. And
they're buying them in the market, which is different because it injects money directly into asset markets.
So that actually boosts the amount of money in the economy, but it's money which is given to people who can, organisations, which can only spend that money buying other assets. Okay, so it drives up demands for assets. That's where the higher prices have come from. But of course, that means everybody in the markets, and I feel this when I talk to family offices and things like that, they are feeling the stress of the level of the value of their assets, depending upon whether central banks continue or stop doing QE. And as you were saying earlier, we're talking about the farming sector. It's the same thing. You've got to worry about a subsidy. And capitalism is stressful enough without wondering whether bureaucrats are going to change the definition of the level of the subsidy on you or not. So that has worked to drive up asset values. But has it caused a wealth effect? Well, in a sense, yes, it has, because in classic Wolf on Wall Street, the Wolf of Wall Street manner, the pension funds, the stockbrokers and so on have been clipping this and getting a nice amount of extra income coming as real cash to them, which they then spend into the economy. But it's trivial as a component of the total economic demand. If you wanted to stimulate demand, you give it not to stockbrokers and so on, and it's a tiny fraction of that they actually get to spend. You give it to people through what is called people's QE.
Well, we also worry that the wealth effect is negative in many ways, because very low rates, particularly in an aging society, very low rates make people feel slightly panicked.
And also lots of people,
they know that if they're getting a very low income or very low yield, they need a much higher level of capital. So even though the value of their assets have gone up, they still feel obliged to save more and more and more. And we know that in terms of pension savings for people my age, for example. People my age, instead of thinking, oh well, the value of the capital value of my pension fund has gone up, we think, oh my God, I'm going to need quadruple what I needed 10 years ago to have a decent income at retirement. So the wealth effect in that sense is negative, and that I think is not in any of the models.
No, and in fact it's turning up in German politics right now too, because German pensioners tend to be more savings oriented than speculating in the stock market, and they're seeing lousy returns. And
they're not spending.
Yeah, they're not spending. So the German pensioners are actually arguing against QE. So one of the classic things. I mean, if you want to prove something is wrong, quote Greenspan saying it's right. Okay, and there was a Greenspan interview where he quoted a paper, a Federal Reserve paper, about how there's a wealth effect from shares, and the paper found there was no wealth effect from shares. The only wealth effect they found was from housing, and it was fairly minor. So we have a false model of money lending, the reserve idea, driving up asset values when inflated asset values are part of the problem. They're too high. The debt level themselves levered up asset prices, and then believing in a wealth effect that doesn't exist.